Hello, my name is Rachel Leidy, and I am the owner of Cyber Sage Solutions, as well as I am a certified CMMC assessor and professional. I'd like to welcome you to my short video series where I will be sharing common issues that I've seen with NIST SP 800-171 implementation and the associated lessons learned. Each day this week, I'm going to be posting one short video. I'm trying to keep it under 20 minutes, but sometimes I could go on tangents. And the initial thought was to share this information in a very informal way. However, I did put together a fancy presentation just to keep me on track and to make sure that I communicate all of the key information that I would like to share today. Again, these videos are about NIST SP 800-171 implementation issues that lead to one or more security control failure. And these issues are occurring frequently enough that I felt this information needed to be shared in hopes that someone could use this information and implement the NIST SP 800-171 requirements accurately in their environment and prevent any security control failures during assessment. Today's topic is going to be scoping. This is video 1 of 5. If you're interested in catching the next 4 videos, feel free to follow me on LinkedIn, as that is where I'm going to be posting these videos. Lastly, if you find that this information is helpful in any way or informative, I would appreciate a comment or a reaction or even sharing the video, so that way this information hopefully will find all of the individuals that would benefit from learning about these issues. Today we're going to talk about scoping, what it is, what's the purpose of scoping, and then I'm going to go briefly over the different asset types. Then I'll focus specifically on out-of-scope assets and how issues around improper separation or lack of separation for out-of-scope assets will lead to multiple security control failures. The second lesson I would like to talk about is interaction oversight and the requirement to really understand, or the need to really understand, how your systems are interacting with CUI information or protecting CUI information, so that way you can properly categorize them and implement the associated requirements and prepare for an assessment. The third lesson is related to contractor risk managed assets, CRMAs, and lack of documentation on control implementation. The fourth lesson is related to system security plan documentation and issues surrounding the lack of implementation narrative for all in-scope assets. And then the last lesson today is related to CMMC resources and supporting documentation that is publicly available and is extremely helpful when you are working toward implementing these requirements, as well as preparing for an assessment. Okay, so scoping. What is scoping and what's the purpose of scoping? The purpose of scoping is to identify the assets in your environment that will be included in a NIST SP 800-171 validation assessment or a CMMC assessment. The purpose is to identify assets that store, process, or transmit CUI information or provide security protection to assets that store, process, or transmit CUI information. Another purpose of scoping is also to identify those assets in your environment that cannot store, process, or transmit CUI information and do not provide security functionality or capabilities, and therefore do not need to implement the NIST SP 800-171 requirements and will not be included in any implementation assessments. In order to properly categorize your information systems and assets and to define your CMMC assessment scope, you will need to have a good understanding on for how your systems are interacting with CUI information or protecting CUI information. And then using that understanding, you will then categorize your assets with the category shown here. And then that categorization is going to drive the specific requirements that need to be implemented for that asset and how that asset comes into play during an assessment. So real quick, I'm going to go over the different asset types, the asset categories, and then we're going to focus mainly on out-of-scope assets and CRMAs. So CUI assets are assets that store, process, or transmit CUI information. Pretty simple. SPAs, or security protection assets, are assets that implement NIST SP 800-171 security requirements, security functionality and capability for your CUI assets or other assets in your CMMC assessment scope. A CRMA is a contractor risk managed asset. These assets can store, process, or transmit CUI information, but are not intended to due to company policy, procedure, or practice in place. A specialized asset is an asset that does store, process, or transmit CUI, but due to the type of information system it is, due to the technical restrictions and nature of the system, it is unable to implement all or some of the NIST SP 800-171 requirements. Out-of-scope assets are those assets that cannot store, process, or transmit CUI information and do not provide security functionality to the assets in scope of a CMMC assessment. And then the last, external service providers. This is not a category of asset. However, it is essential during your scoping activities to identify the external service providers that are storing, processing, or transmitting CUI information or security protection information, security protection data, for your environment to ensure that these external service providers are meeting the requirements. So separation failures and out-of-scope assets. This is issue number one. Lesson learned number one is that it's not enough to say an asset in your environment does not store, process, or transmit CUI information. It's not enough to say that users do not use that asset to access CUI information. It's not enough to say that those assets do not provide any security capability or functionality to your CMMC assessment scope assets. You have to also make sure that those assets, out of scope assets, are logically and or physically separated from your CUI assets. That's really, really important, because if they are not separated, if they are not adequately separated, then you cannot identify those assets as out of scope assets. And so this diagram here, I tried to put a diagram together that depicts what I've seen in several assessments and consulting projects, where an organization has identified their CUI assets, and then they have identified out of scope assets. And then going into reviewing of the security controls and understanding the environment a little bit more, it's determined that these out of scope assets, yes, they don't store, process, or transmit CUI. Yes, they don't provide security protection, but no, they are not physically or logically separated from the CUI assets that are in scope of the requirements. And the reason why you have to logically or physically separate them is because it's like a basic network security 101 concept, is that assets, information systems that reside on the same network, the same environment, the same segment, information systems or assets that are physically and or logically connected, all pose risks to each other. Where there's one system may have a weakness, it's a weakness for the entire environment, because that weakness can be exploited by an attacker or malware and then be used to gain access to the environment and then pivot to other systems that do store CUI information. And so in this situation, where it was unfortunate because it was found one of the times in a JSVA that there was a asset that was deemed to be out of scope, and then based on our discussions and interviewing the system administrators focusing on other controls, it was brought up that those assets are not physically or logically separated, and therefore they could not have been they should not have been identified as out of scope. And then during that assessment, and what will happen if this does happen to you, is those assets then are brought into scope and they will be evaluated for NIST SP 800-171 implementation. And so if you're going into an assessment, or if you're going into developing your NIST SP 800-171 environment with the mindset that these assets are out of scope, you may not evaluate this security controls implemented on those assets, or you may not focus on them, right? You may not prioritize the security of those systems. And later on, when it is determined that it should have been in scope, now you have some compliance gaps and some security gaps that are going to lead to security control failures. One thing you can do is, if there is a business need for these assets to be not logically or physically separated from your CUI assets, then you would categorize them as CRMAs, contractor risk managed assets. It does not alleviate the need or the requirement to implement NIST SP 800-171 security controls on those assets, the ones that are applicable to that type of asset. But it does alleviate that during your assessment, the CRMAs, the implementation of NIST SP 171 is not going to be evaluated during that assessment if appropriately documented. And we're going to cover that in, I think, issue number 3 or 4. So let's recap. The first issue I'm seeing and associated lessons learned is the failure to properly separate out-of-scope assets from in-scope assets. This can lead to an expanded scope or potentially halting the assessment because those out-of-scope assets now are in scope and they do need to be evaluated for NIST 171 implementation. And like I said, if you previously weren't tracking those controls as required to implement the requirements, or it's been a while since you evaluated the security of those systems and the compliance of those systems, then during your assessment, it's going to lead to some security control failures. Also, this is going to lengthen the assessment. Depending on when these assets are found, you may have to go back and reevaluate some security controls that have already been assessed, the technical security controls that would need to be implemented in that type of system, lengthening the assessment, as well as just introducing a whole nother asset type into your assessment could lengthen the assessment. And then really when it comes to lack of documentation on the security controls and how they're implemented in these out-of-scope assets, that will also lengthen the assessment duration because you have more of a conversation that needs to occur and happen during the assessment, and the assessor did not have time to prep for evaluating the controls on that type of asset. So the lessons learned and what you're going to want to do is to ensure that for any out-of-scope assets, you are properly separating them, which then is overall going to reduce the risks posed to your in-scope systems, as well as limit your assessment scope and potentially limit the cost of NIST SP 800-171 implementation and maintenance. Okay, lessons learned, or issue number 2, relates to understanding in detail how your systems are interacting with CUI information, or how your systems are providing security protection to CUI information or CUI assets. You've probably heard me say several times now, store, process, transmit, right? It's store, process, transmit, or provide security functionality and capability. So understanding the assets in your environment and, are they storing the information solely? Are they storing and processing the information? Are they doing all 3? Are they doing all 4? Understanding how these systems are interacting with the information, as well as other systems in your CMMC assessment scope, is crucial to ensuring that you are identifying all in-scope assets and appropriately categorizing them. And the issue I've seen here relates to software as a service. One second. And that I've seen organizations who are employing the use of a software as a service tool. It is advertising encrypted storage, encrypted transfer, secure file sharing, all this great stuff. It's a great, helpful tool. But then, during the scoping process, the organization identifies that software as a service as the CUI asset and then fails to identify the user endpoint that is interacting with that software as a CUI asset. And this may not be applicable to all software as a service offerings, depending on the functionality, capabilities, how you're interacting, how you're using the tool. But in general, I've seen a good number of these tools being utilized to help organizations meet the NIST SP 800-171 requirements, but then the organization fails to factor in that user endpoint is also potentially a CUI asset or a security protection asset. With this specific piece of software, I've seen on many occasions where the software is identified as a CUI asset and the endpoint isn't addressed at all. And therefore, that company is not identifying in any of their system security plan documentation how the security requirements are implemented on that asset, enforced on that asset. And it leads to a lot of security control failures and compliance gaps. So in that specific case, the organizations were failing to recognize that when users access that information or open the documents in Word or Excel, or maybe they download it, or they've mapped their file explorer to the cloud environment so that they can access that document fairly quickly, and then they save it locally on accident. Stuff like that happens. Even when they download it to print it, that's all processing. You're processing that information. It now no longer resides within the software as a service encrypted environment. It now is being processed on your local endpoint in this situation. And that endpoint then is a CUI asset and needs to implement the NIST SP 800-171 requirements. So that's the lesson learned here, is interaction oversight and understanding how your systems are interacting with this data, CUI data, how they're protecting CUI data, as well as how they're interacting together. Failure to understand CUI interaction will lead to gaps in identifying assets that store, process, or transmit and or protect CUI, leading to assessment failures, security control failures. And then similar to item number one, if you didn't previously think to address the NIST SP 800-171 controls on those assets, you're going to find gaps, you're going to find compliance gaps, issues, and addressing those controls in an assessment is going to lengthen the assessment, because you have to then kind of refresh your memory. How is that system being protected, and what GPO, what setting it is enforcing that, and it does lengthen the assessment. So what you'll want to do is to ensure understanding of your systems and data interaction and evaluate your systems for each of the above objectives. CRMAs, contractor risk managed assets. This next lessons learned issue relates to CRMAs being identified in the environment, but then for some reason the organization is not aware that CRMAs have to implement NIST SP 800-171 requirements, or they are not aware that they need to address the security around these systems adequately enough in their documentation in order to not bring them into an assessment. So real quick, the CRMA again stands for assets that can but are not intended to store, process, or transmit CUI because of a security policy, procedure, or practice in place. These assets are not required to be physically or logically separated from CUI assets. So back to item number 1, if these assets are on the same environment, same network, same segment, if they are attached or not separated from your CUI assets, then they need to be managed the same way, so that way they cannot pose risks or introduce risks, vulnerabilities, weaknesses, malware into your environment that is also hosting CUI assets. So they don't need to be logically or physically separated, but they do need to implement the NIST SP 800-171 controls. And the issue I'm seeing is that organizations who do say they have CRMAs either do not address how these assets are covered by security policies, procedures, and processes, or they do not address them at all, thinking that the CRMAs don't have to implement the NIST SP 800-171 controls, and lack of documentation is going to result in these CRMA assets being pulled into scope and being fully assessed for NIST 171 implementation during your assessment. And then that still relates to, if previously you didn't think that you needed to implement the controls on these assets, you're going to have compliance gaps. All of this leads to more than many security control failures. The fourth issue here I'm seeing a lot is system security plan. It's in your system security plan, you are required to define the method of security requirement implementation. That is required for all in-scope assets, CUI assets, CRMA assets, SPA assets, specialized assets. So what I've seen pretty commonly is that an organization will have a system security plan that appears to be well written, but then as you start digging into each control requirement and reading the implementation narrative, it is lacking in defining how that control requirement is implemented in all in-scope assets and all IT products. And I'll provide you an example. If you're an organization and you have a Windows server and a Linux server and a database server, and then you have an SSP, and it just addresses how these security controls are implemented and enforced for the Windows servers, and it doesn't address how Linux servers are picking up the policies and procedures, policies and settings, or how your database is picking up those control requirements and enforcing those control requirements. Another example is I've seen where an organization may have a couple assets that are non-domain joined, or they'll have a handful of assets that are just not on the network at all. And these assets are CUI assets, and they are not picking up the Entra ID or Active ID, GPOs, policies, conditional access policies, whatever have you, because they're not on the domain. And so their system security plan just talks about Active Directory or Enter ID is the method being used to push out and enforce these control requirements, but it does not address how the control requirements are being implemented and enforced on those non-domain joined assets. So just a couple examples. The issue here is that failure to define how security controls are implemented and enforced for all in-scope assets will result in a prolonged and challenging assessment. There'll be more discussions, there'll be more things to look at, as well as unmet security controls and objectives, specifically the ones where it talks about defining. I see a lot of failures there when it comes to lack of addressing security control implementation for all assets in scope. So the lesson is to ensure you address the security control implementation for all assets in scope. All right, the last item here is related to guidance awareness and just being educated on and informed of the multiple free and publicly available CMMC NIST SP 800-171 resources and documentation that's available, which is extremely helpful in identifying how to implement these controls and how to prepare for an assessment. So in general, I'm just seeing many organizations not fully aware of all of this information that they do have available to them for free. The only link that I thought best to address in this presentation is the DoD CIO's CMMC website. You could Google DoD CIO's CMMC documentation, and it's going to bring you to a page that lists out a bunch of resources, a bunch of documents, a bunch of references that are essential to have access to knowing how to implement these requirements and how to prepare for an assessment. Bigger issue here that I'm kind of seeing is that organizations are employing the use of a managed service provider to implement these requirements for them, which is great. However, ultimately, it's the responsibility of the organization to implement the requirements. And the MSP is not going to be the one that fails the assessment or struggles during the assessment. It's going to be the organization. And I highly recommend that even if you are employing the use of an MSP, that someone in the company is knowledgeable enough or is aware of the requirements and the responsibilities at a high enough level that they can ensure the MSP is doing what is needed to be done. Other free resources, of course, LinkedIn, there's a bunch of information out there. YouTube is great. There's a lot of good information out there. So the issue is not seeing organizations being proactive in understanding what is required of them and ensuring that individuals, whether they're in their organization or external to their organization, are properly implementing these requirements. So the lesson here is to check out these resources, educate yourself, or have someone else educate themselves a little bit, stay informed, and this is going to help you avoid common assessment challenges and ensure a smoother compliance effort and assessment for your organization. All right, that was the last lessons learned, and I'm at 35 minutes, so I have gone over my time. I hope this video was helpful. I hope I accurately and clearly communicated the issues that I've seen and how you can avoid them for your organization. I hope that you just found this helpful. Yeah. But if you have any questions, comments, concerns, issues, or need help, feel free to email me at support@cybersagesolutions.io, and I will respond as soon as possible. Thank you.